We're going to get started. It's about 3 minutes after 11. And like I said, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm sure folks will be joining us as we get rolling here. So welcome and thank you for attending the panel today titled After the Vote, which is going to center around civic engagement and how to communicate the importance of staying politically engaged, whether it's during the presidential election, midterms, or even just at the state and local level. And engaged, it doesn't necessarily mean filling out your ballot and voting, although obviously that's a huge component of it. But you can be politically engaged year round and maybe not even be a registered voter. Just something that sounds a little strange, but I wanted to give you an example of that. If you come back with me about 15 years, 2006, that's when I first got my start doing some voter registration and voter organizing with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, back when I lived in Lexington, Kentucky. The two core issues that we worked on at Kentuckians for the Commonwealth were banning mountaintop removal mining, where you take the top of a mountain, blow it up, and you get the coal inside it, and restoring voting rights to people with felony records. So as a kind of young guy dipping my toes in the water here, I was knocking on doors. I tabled University of Kentucky's campus, the downtown bus station. I went to Festival Latino as well as Juneteenth, all of these things in Lexington, Kentucky, just getting out and talking about these issues with people and also seeing if they were registered to vote, explaining a little bit about that process. At that time in Kentucky, however, people with felony convictions had their voting rights stripped, and they only got the voting rights returned by the governor after this really lengthy appeals process once somebody had gotten out of prison. Which actually involved writing a letter to the governor. So obviously it was really intentionally made to disenfranchise people who had a felony on their record. So obviously here, there's an intersection that we will talk about a little bit further in this panel between social justice and environmental issues, as well as what I think was really important, which was a pathway to meet people where they were at regarding voting. So if I would be out trying to register people to vote, I would meet people who'd say, I can't vote, I'm a felon. But in Kentucky, they were right, but it really opened the door to me to talk about half of the organizing that we were doing, which was getting people with felonies on their records involved in this movement to push really hard at the state level, at the legislative level, so that we could get this law overturned. And we built a movement. It took about 20 years, but we had a victory. And I still consider myself, I'm a member of Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. I'm still a donor. We had a victory just last year with the right to vote being restored to most people convicted of felonies in Kentucky. And the reason I share this is just because I wanted to illustrate something for you all. Voter organizing is multifaceted, and it can't really just be about getting people to check a certain box once every 4 years. It's not really how we build power. It requires those of us that are doing it to know where people are at and to meet them where they're at in their lives. And so that's why I wanted to share that example for you all. So I am going to turn it over to our moderator, Skyla Jewell-Hammie, and I think our panelists are going to self-introduce. So thanks again for being here, and I'm looking forward to this opportunity to share some of our experiences with you all.
Hi, thanks, Bill. I'm Skyla Jewell-Hammie. I am the eco-journalism blogging intern for WMEAC right now. And for this panel discussion, I will be the moderator. And for right now, I'm just going to have each panelist introduce themselves and give a little brief introduction of why they're here and what they plan on speaking about and what they do. So we can just go ahead and start with Lin Bardwell.
Uju Nisha Kwe Indigenous Waganak Singodawa, Anishinaabe Kwayandao, Mon Dem. My name is Lin Bardwell. I'm a member of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. I am the current president of WMEAC's Board of Directors and currently work at Grand Valley State University on an initiative to increase recruitment and retention for our Native students, while increasing their visibility on campus and making sure that they're cared for while they're in attendance there. And I'm just here to hopefully bring an Indigenous perspective and to kind of decolonize the thoughts that we're having and create action moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Next we'll have Carissa.
Hi everyone, I'm Carissa Patrone. I'm the Equity Program Manager for the West Michigan Sustainable Business Forum. And I'm here today to bring a little bit of that business perspective and how businesses can really be a force for good in regards to civic engagement, but also forwarding and advancing equity within our communities as well.
Thanks, Carissa. And lastly, we'll have Sergio.
Good morning. My name is Sergio Cira-Reyes. I'm working on environmental justice with the Urban Core Collective, also involved with the Latino Community Coalition of West Michigan and the Latino Network of West Michigan.
Thank you. So we're going to get started into the questions in the panel discussion. And I'm first going to start on the proposal 1 that was seen on the ballot this year. Proposal 1 commits all future revenue from state-owned oil, gas, and minerals to the protection of natural resources, outdoor recreation, and our parks via the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund and State Park Endowment Fund. It also supports the protection of and access to outdoor spaces. Lastly, it will allow for more efficient use of resources. Can either of you say a few words on how this impacts our environment and society? How does that affect youth in POC communities?
I can talk a little bit about, I think, the nuances of it. I think it's a good thing to fund the maintenance and the protection of our natural resources and in the many different ways that you mentioned, Skyla. But I think that there's a danger in allowing the oil industry to create a narrative in which they are able to say that thanks to the way they do business, that we are now protecting natural resources. It also enables conservative lawmakers to then defund these agencies that would be protecting something that is like that is our patrimony, right? That is something that should be protected in perpetuity. And so I think that it also allows for them to do that for lawmakers. And so I think we need to be careful to first start from the point where the maintenance, the preservation, and policy should always be created to protect natural resources that are vital to our survival long-term, but also that belong to the indigenous communities that were here before and protects their way of life and their survival. And so start with that federal funds, federal policy should always be in place to protect that and never allow a private company to be the single source or to start working to being a considerable source of dependency for the preservation of these natural resources.
Thanks, Sergio. That was a really good answer to a question I'm still confused at for myself. I feel like our state and federal government should not fully rely on funding from the gas and oil companies. I get that they have a responsibility, but I feel like we're not looking at other avenues to protect our parks and recreational areas, and we become dependent on this other funding. And I'll have to admit that I'm not really versed up on proposal 1. A really great work session with WMEAC when they invited a speaker to kind of cover the yes and no's perspective of this particular proposal. In Indian country, we have the Anishinaabe caucus, and I noticed that they were pushing for a no. And I didn't really have the opportunity to ask why, but I feel like as an Anishinaabe person and community, we really need to find another way to fund some of these necessary things outside of on non-renewable energy sources. So I'm just still kind of perplexed, and I'm curious as to the other conversations that we're having here, so I can walk away more informed.
I think too, just speaking from my own perspective, looking at where we're at now and how, the cap has been lifted, you know, the funding is supposed to be going to state park improvement, recreation areas, but I'm just wondering if you, any of you, I guess, on the panel or otherwise, know how communities or parks or areas might be prioritized within this funding in an equitable way or not, or what the plans are for that. I'm not sure if maybe one of you could speak to that if you know anything regarding that piece.
I guess my perspective is there's an agreement within the treaty systems within the federal government that any state lands that the state no longer wants. Please don't quote me on this, but I feel like tribal sovereign nations should have or are carved out in these treaties that they have the first rights of refusal for the property. I know there's a huge land back movement in indigenous country, and I'm excited about that. I don't know what the reality of that is, but I feel like tribal organizations or sovereign nations should have a bigger seat at the table when deciding on how to manage these parks and recreational areas. And I don't think that we've had a seat at the table in the past. We, you know, all 12 sovereign nations of the state of Michigan all have a natural resources department. They are all actively working in protecting their own land for spiritual and cultural uses. So I feel like the state of Michigan and the federal government, right, is missing out on a huge voice on how to continue to manage the land. We've been doing it for about 30,000 years in this area. And so I feel like general society is really missing out on an opportunity to really gather some best practices when it comes to land management. I don't know if that answered the question.
If I could jump in real quick, Carissa, that's a great question. And so WMEAC will continue to be part of the coalition that helped to push for Proposition 1 to get passed. And I think some of the mechanisms for how to access the additional funding are going to still, they have to be sorted out in Lansing. And as WMEAC intends to still be part of that, I'd love to have anybody from this call that wants to continue to be involved, just stay in contact with us as well, because you're right. Part of why we joined up in the coalition and pushed for this was we saw an opportunity for more equitable distribution of funds to go to parks that were seeing a lot of increased use, especially during COVID. And a lot of people don't realize that the DNR has property in all of the largest urban areas of Michigan and in cities in Michigan. And so what I'd like to suggest is that we continue with people that are interested in this issue, continue to be involved and speak up, because they still, at the state level, if I'm not mistaken, still have to kind of figure out the mechanisms by which this funding is going to be accessed. So there is an opportunity to make the statements that are being made here to the people that actually make those decisions. So I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to weigh in. Fran might have a question too.
I do. Well, I have a clarification I need. Proposal 1 was specifically related to fossil fuels, some gathered and profits made from those fossil fuels that were taken from public lands. Is that not correct? So I have a basic problem with the idea of pulling fossil fuels off of private land or public lands. That was my, I don't, I mean, I guess if you're going to do something with the money, that would be the thing to do with it. But I just have a problem with the basic premise of that as a resource.
Right, and I don't disagree with you, Fran. For a quick overview of the history of this, the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund was established after WMEAC was a litigant against Shell Oil and Gas in the Pigeon River country, I believe in the 1980s, although I don't know the exact date. And it was really the result of a compromise where we tried to completely shut down oil and gas exploration in the largest sort of natural area in the lower peninsula. And this is what came out of it as a result of, going to the table with lawyers from Shell versus, people from WMEAC. Not that we don't have good attorneys, or we did at least at that time, but this was the compromise that was made. And the idea being that as you put it, the money's going to go somewhere. The goal with this was to lift the cap so that we could actually pull more of the money out during this period of extraction that isn't magically going to end tomorrow. The idea being that that will decline someday, and this will help backfill some money that will exist in perpetuity. So that's just a little bit of the history of that. And that was why we were on board, because that was certainly one of my questions too. As an organization that fights climate change, where are we at trying to support funding coming from fossil fuel extraction? And I understand it's a bit of a mental tightrope to walk on, but that was kind of the process by which we determined that we were supportive of it and the history of WMEAC being involved in the first place.
Thank you for the clarification.
Anybody else want to add anything else to the first question? Okay, on to the second one. Concerning air quality, can either of you add how important it is for businesses to create a message behind quality advocacy?
I can start with this one. So we know through a lot of different studies that zip code is the single most potent predictor of an individual's health and well-being. And we know that through historical policies and procedures, redlining, sacrifice zones that were created in communities of color, that historical toxic waste and hazardous waste dumping happens within specific communities. And air quality is just as much an environmental justice issue as it is an issue of environmental racism. So, you know, these are the historical policies and procedures that have completely differently disadvantaged individuals, really just dependent on race and income. So looking more deeply into air quality and how that impacts communities, specifically communities of color, the University of Michigan had found that people of color breathe almost 38% more polluted air than their white counterparts. There are, you know, African Americans and Latinx folks are also around 1.5 more times exposed to particulate matter in the air. And that's even found in the Grand Rapids area as well. So we know that the Census Tract 39 is the #1 environmental justice pollution community or environmental justice community within the state of Michigan. And because of a number of factors, but due to particulate matter, asthma rates, cancer rates, and then proximity to traffic as well. And recently, it was passed actually on August 25th, there was a truck route that had cut through Granville Avenue within that community in Roosevelt Park that is consists of the #1 environmental justice community in Michigan. And we also saw how COVID rates completely tie into like elevated levels of particulate matter increases the kind of reaction within your lungs and increases the chances that you might die from COVID-19. So everything is completely intersectional. And just even though, you know, the truck route was changed to kind of go around the community, the truck traffic is still happening. And within that section of Grand Rapids, because it lies within a mile of the national highway system, it can't be legally enforced. So even though trucks continue to go down Granville Avenue, nothing can legally be enforced about that. So really businesses have to be a part of that solution. And even though, you know, historically businesses have done a lot of the, you know, toxic pollution over time and continue to do so today, without them as a part of a solution, I think we've kind of come to a standstill. So right now we're working with the Roosevelt Park Neighborhood Association along with a few other nonprofit organizations to see how we can encourage businesses to kind of adopt a voluntary reroute of their trucks, not only for environmental justice issues and air pollution, but because of safety within that community. So there are a lot of ways that businesses can also be a part of the solution, specifically within this problem, because there's no other way to enforce it. It has to then stem from encouraging businesses to make that change. So I think it's really, tackling some of these environmental justice issues, or whether it's air pollution or otherwise, it needs to kind of be a cross-sectoral approach and collaborative, because I think with more voices at the table and more organizations on board, more advocates, more systemic change can happen when more folks are engaged.
I'd like to echo like the intersectionality of all of that, because there's so many factors, right? You got COVID, you have health insurance, access to health insurance, and then you even have access to higher education, right? So that's my field. And when you have decreased access to higher education experienced by POC and by POC, you're lacking that voice to help assist with the problem solution. Activism is really tough in a lot of communities, as like if you look at it from a poverty perspective, a lot of our families are just struggling to make it day by day, especially now that it's exacerbated through COVID. It's hard to balance all of these things that affect us from the external, to be involved and to be activated. And so I don't know what the solution is. Again, I work in higher education, and I'm working really hard to make sure that the university is safe for our Indigenous students, so that they can get to this colonized credentialization, that they now have a seat at the table and are respected from a colonial perspective. But we just need to acknowledge that it is hard for a lot of our communities of color to fill all of these needs, while they're struggling. From a personal experience, I'm struggling myself, and it's hard to be an active participant in all of these areas of intersectionality, and it's hard to compartmentalize it. Like, where do I focus my attention today, and how do I become activated in this area? Because everything overlaps, everything is compounded, and then when you bring in the facts that the panelists just mentioned, it's hard not to feel helpless and hopeless in that situation. So from a person of color's perspective, I really appreciate all the allies that we have and the organizations that do kind of take up this work in these spaces. And I'll do my part by making sure that Grand Valley's trying to become safer for, populations of color. Thank you.
So I want to say that I think recognizing the powerful lobby that is the business community in every city is a good point to start. In Grand Rapids, the Grand Rapids Chamber is a significant influence in policy, commerce, and economic prosperity for the city has always been the number one goal driver of any city manager, any mayor in the city of Grand Rapids, and then especially downtown authorities. That is commerce and economic, prosperity is always something that is of great influence, and I think that's the one reason I can think of why it's important for the business community to get on board, to jump on this bandwagon and start looking at air quality and air pollution. The other is that this is a changing world, and these changing economy and also the clients that businesses are seeing now are more informed. They have access to more information. They're more politically savvy, and they're getting it, right? We're hitting critical mass with air pollution, and we're seeing the impacts of this. We're seeing it on the news all the time. I remember as a kid, like I was looking at the different like National Geographic's nature shows, and they were talking, if we don't change our behavior, the ice can, these changes are going to happen. When I see these same shows on for National Geographics or different, like that already happened, right? And so that's not something that we can discuss anymore, argue about. It's more about whether businesses can look to the future and see what their clients are going to demand of them and what behavior they see in them. We all saw what happened with Founders, and when they had an issue with racism and somebody was fired because of it. We all saw what happened with Anna's House when they had another incident where, you know, people of color were being treated differently, and how clients responded here in Grand Rapids. And so I think the same is true for other businesses. We're watching them to see how they're responding with issues that are of importance to us. And people are nowadays voting with their dollars, and we're not afraid to hold people accountable. For that, so I think that this is why it's important for businesses to jump on this, to take ownership of this. I've seen like businesses like Vivant that have like their C Corps and businesses that are looking at triple bottom lines, protecting, you know, to them it's important to make a profit, yes, but also their employees and the environment. And this is what aligns very well with that. And I think that businesses that are to be sustainable and viable in the future need to look to the future and look at what's changing and how they're going to look, you know, in 10 years when everyone else was on board, was putting in their part to do something about like the direction in which we're heading.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points, right? Like voting every day with our dollar. That was something I learned, you know, when we were in Standing Rock, is it's really important for us to understand where we're spending our money, because all of these businesses ultimately, you know, profit is the bottom dollar. Hopefully the, you know, the business program and the MBAs of these universities are focusing more on the triple bottom line as we educate our future, you know, business leaders. It's important that we do keep a watch on our local businesses, and we try to shop and support the smaller businesses who are actively working for the community and not against it. So thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, does anybody else want to add to this question of air quality and advocacy for businesses? Okay. I first want to touch, before I move on to the next question, Erica did put it in the chat, but I just want to say it so everyone knows and who else is viewing. POC, or POC, stands for People of Color, and BIPOC, which is BIPOC, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Okay. So the third question is, according to the Radio Results Network, the Line 5 pipeline was installed in 1953 in the Straits of Mackinac. The lifespan was 30 years. The line managing company, Enbridge, has caused controversy amongst environmental activists over the pipeline erosion, violations, and broken support. Can either of you speak about the impact of the Line 5 pipeline to the surrounding Indigenous tribes, which is considered the Chippewa-Ottawa Resource Authority, that consists of Grand Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Chippewa Indians, Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Indians, and Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians.
So I guess I'll talk a little bit about it from an Indigenous perspective. I was first introduced to CORA while I was serving on tribal council for the Little Traverse Bay Bands. And, you know, like any organization that has multiple partners and collaborations between organizations, there's always conflict within. I think CORA does a really good job of keeping some of that conflict internal and presenting to the outside with a unified voice. But there are internal conflicts that exist within CORA. They do all operate with an inland consent decree that is between CORA and the state of Michigan. And what that does is carve out our ability to manage our own lands. And lands is being defined as tribally owned properties, and not so much as a land-based reservation. There's a lot of uniqueness to Michigan compared to like the tribes out west they're more land-based, whereas in Michigan, since it's highly colonized, we have patchwork. And so we don't all manage every land within our carved out reservations yet. But Cora is a seat at that table that we recognized earlier. And I think with line 5, it goes beyond Cora. I think line 5 is a detriment to all of the Great Lakes, right? And look at how much commerce is done within the confines of that lake. Tourism, all kinds of things, fishing. Cora has a huge part in the fishing aspect of the northern Michigan area, but line 5 is a detriment to everything, from Chicago all the way around to Lake Erie, if that were to, become compromised. I don't feel like our tribal communities have been heard concerning the line 5, because if it were, it would be shut down. And so what happens is you have all of the tribes in Cora, and then, all the other tribes outside of Cora are all against line 5. And we've been actively protesting the line for obvious reasons. Again, capitalism comes into play. I think Bill said years ago when I first met him that line 5 creates only 4 jobs in the state of Michigan. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's all about the narrative of what's being told to residents of Michigan, Canada, and the surrounding Great Lakes states, is that it's this huge economic boom for us, and it's really not. But I feel like, again, our tribal governments, which are sovereign governments, right? We have government to government relationship. The state doesn't have any jurisdiction unless it's pre-agreed to within a compact. I feel like nobody's hearing our tribal governments, and we're all being very active in trying to fight this line 5 the tunneling or whatever. So I'm very happy to hear that either Gretchen or Nestle is, kind of going to bat and defending our tribal nations. Our treaties have carved out our ability to hunt and gather and just be on the lands that were stolen. And I know a lot of people don't understand the treaties, and there's lots of them, but they are formalized government to government agreements that puts us at an equal standing with the federal government. And I don't feel like that's the reality in the last, 200 years, that we are looked at as equals within the government. So I would, just continue to advocate for our governments to continue to speak out against line 5, and hopefully we can be heard.
I want to add really quickly, the line 5 update, there was just a update with Whitmer, and she tried to revoke the longstanding alliance with Enbridge, and Enbridge is freaking out a bit over that, and they are submitting a federal complaint to Whitmer's line 5 shutdown order, because they believe that they are doing help for the Great Lakes. In a quote to them, they said, "It is concerning to see the current administration is willing to compromise these needs. We remain highly committed to protecting the Great Lakes, the environment, and all the people who use these waters while delivering energy that people rely on daily." And then in contrast to that, the Cora, the Chippewa Ottawa Resource Authority, actually won awards for their clean water action and trying to protect their land and the communities around them due to the line 5 destruction that could potentially happen and is already happening. So if Lynn, do you want to speak on that a bit, on how that looks, how the company is still fighting against Whitmer?
I think it goes down to narrative, right? They're choosing to use the words that they're helping the environment or helping whatever. And obviously we know that pipelines leak. When they leak, when they're buried underground, eventually we can see, and are able to address it. But when it's under such a valuable water source that feeds millions and millions of homes, it's just irresponsible. And it's how shape the narrative, and they're shaping it in order to best put them in the best light. And the thing is that, if this were to become an issue with leaking oil, it affects so many people other than, the indigenous communities. We all depend on, and I'm not trying to lessen the importance of this issue in indigenous country. It's just something that affects everybody. I feel like indigenous nations have the roles and responsibility of doing everything we can to protect the Great Lakes. But time and time again, our voices become weakened. I mean, Standing Rock is a huge example of how we were silenced quite forcefully. And it wasn't about, and even Cora, we're not just trying to protect the Great Lakes for us, right? They weren't trying to protect the river for them. We realized that this is our responsibility to protect it for everybody. So the narrative is important, and they've got the money to craft and shape it that best serves them. I will give kudos to the state of Michigan for doing what they can to stand up, but they're going to continue to shape the narrative that best serves them.
If I could too, I wanted to point out something that I thought was really important, that we could tie the Line 5 situation back to the prior conversation about business and support, voting with your dollars, so to speak. We've had conversations at various points with the operating engineers union, which the majority of the jobs that Line 5 creates are through that union, and it's basically pipeline maintenance throughout the state. And in a conversation that I had with somebody pretty high up in the organization, he pointed out that his role as essentially a shop steward at this union is to make sure that his members have jobs. He was essentially like, we don't love Line 5, we don't love oil pipelines. If our jobs were building and maintaining wind or solar or other renewable energy, that's perfectly fine. He's like, my job is to make sure that my union has jobs. And I think it's important to consider intersections where there might not always seem like there are them. This is a group that could be allies if we were able to get some large scale renewable development going in Michigan. And there's a lot of talk in the environmental movement about how we miss out working with labor. And oftentimes we get put into opposition with each other. And I would blame that on governmental entities and lobbyists that know that works, right? Divide and conquer kind of mentality. But I just wanted to bring that back to a little bit before talking about the business side of things, and considering who stands to profit from the old way and who could be, brought on board to a more sustainable and renewable energy generation where we're trying to reject and get away from fossil fuels. Thanks.
All right, does anybody else want to add anything?
Well, to bounce off of what Bill's saying is like, it's a whole structural shift, right? We need to find a way to switch, monetary resources into another field. Like if they're worried about jobs, I get it. We're all worried about jobs in this time of COVID. And I feel like, and these are the conversations I've had with a couple of tribal leaders when we talk about revenue and resources and the economics of our current situation, is like we're sitting in a really good time as tribal communities to reevaluate and strategically plan or shift how we provide for our citizens. And so on the micro level of tribal nations, right, like we're trying to look at how we sustain ourselves in this new world where our casinos could be shut down, And for those of you joining the call that don't understand, our casino revenue completely funds our tribal governments, which provides the health care, the social care, the education of our citizens. And so when they shut down, our government ceases to bring in dollars. So I feel like when you look at the macro level of our current economic system, of the shift that Bill just spoke about, I think we're sitting in a really good opportunity to hopefully push that shift into other avenues of energy. And I just feel like, this pandemic comes around every 100 years, and we need to take this opportunity to really step back and look at how our structure is set up and how we can move forward. We're all affected by the COVID, whether it's our employment, whether it's school, whatever. And through these hard times is a really great opportunity to sit back and look at how we can shift the structure. I'm really good at seeing the structure. I'm not so good at seeing the things that lead up into the big umbrella view. So I depend on people I work with to kind of like fill in those spaces as I look at the 5,000 foot view. But I feel like we're in a really good opportunity to step back, slow down, and reevaluate where we are and where we're going.
Anybody else want to add to that? Okay. Following up on the last question, it's kind of closely tied. Can either of you talk about how Indigenous land acknowledgement is made aware across the country? For example, in the past couple of years, Western Michigan University held an event to honor the Indigenous land WMU sat on. As a WMU senior, I was actually reporting for that event, and it was pretty admirable to see Western doing that, but also concerning because that's also seen as the out of the norm and out of the ordinary, which is something that every business or organization should do, is recognize the Indigenous land that they sit on. So can any of you speak on that, and how can other businesses and organization follow in that lead?
So land acknowledgements, I think, are important because they're conversation starters for people who have never heard one. They're conversation starters for people who have been asked to do a land acknowledgement. And I feel like anything that starts and invokes a conversation is good. I will say, though, that I feel a lot of institutions feel that a land acknowledgement is a one-stop shop and boom, we're done. We've acknowledged the land. And I'm not saying that's what Western Michigan University has done or any other institution at the leadership level. My work at Grand Valley, in collaboration with our only Indigenous professor at Grand Valley, is to create land acknowledgements that have a call to action. Because me as an individual, and to me as in my community, you can acknowledge the land, but that doesn't truly affect our social standing. Trying to figure out a better way to say these, my opinion. I feel like a lot of places feel as if their work is done by creating a land acknowledgement. And that is just the first step in any equitable outcome for Indigenous people. I feel like if you're acknowledging my land, then what are you doing to better the reality in which my people exist in? So for instance, at Grand Valley, we're trying to do a campus-wide faculty and staff education component on land acknowledgements, so that each department or each silo within the university can put in an action step that will result in increasing retention, increasing recruitment, and increasing our visibility on campus. Michigan State has a really robust Indigenous program, and I'm excited to see that and to learn from that. But even from an internal perspective, those Indigenous departments and programs and services still struggle on the campus. And so I'm excited for Grand Valley to have a land acknowledgement and have a big event like Western Michigan, but also working within Western Michigan as I do on the peripheral, it seems as if there's no other movement in inclusion and equity and diversity offices of these institutions to put those land acknowledgements into motion. So again, like at Grand Valley, we are hoping that each one of our departments and silos and divisions will institute their own land acknowledgement that includes an action step. Like, what are you going to do to better our individual communities? It's important that we acknowledge the land. It's said before that all institutions are built on stolen land, and we need to recognize that that land was stolen. But my work centers how to make reality better for my community members. And that means, in the world of higher education, it's increasing our visibility, it's increasing our support system, it's increasing our network. Native students are always the smallest, subpopulation within any institution. I like to take credit for having WMEAC and saying that we are a very indigenized board of directors, because I pulled along, a tribal citizen of mine, and we are the only non-Native institution that I can think of that has 2 Native people on the board. And so it's more about acknowledging the land, and it's about what are you going to do as an institution, as an organization, to better the realities of our Native communities, our urban Native communities, right? In Grand Rapids, we, our Native community suffered diaspora just like every, marginalized population. And so we don't have like this hold on any specific sector of Grand Rapids, but we do exist. The 2010 census says we have 1,500 Natives living in Kent County. But we don't have like a specific neighborhood or a street or an association. And so when you don't have that collective voice or that collective power, then that reduces and, de-amplifies our voice. So I feel land acknowledgements are good. It's just what then? What's the next step for these organizations after they read the acknowledgement?
We're cutting close on time, so we're gonna move sort of quickly at this last part. But going off of Lin's answer as well, we're gonna tie in outreach to all BIPOC communities. And these are the times that we have to be super honest about representation and through businesses and how that impacts communities. This is a time where the marginalized groups need to hold the microphone, need to have the seat at the table. People of color are tended to be excluded from important decisions. And how can we get people of color to be included in those decisions and advocate to build and grow from that?
So I can, so speaking about, so I think a good start is kind of the way you were framing your question, Skyla, that the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. I think that's a good start. And when we're talking about environmental injustice, when we're talking about equity and the intersection of that, and especially communities that are being erased and communities that are not given that power, and that's what we're talking about, power. Regardless of the position, there should be power in line with it. I think that's a good place to start. I think that with voter suppression and voting and this conversation, what's next, we should really be thinking about how to, especially in this work, think about the intersection of these communities and BIPOC communities that have been struggling with other issues that have been more closer, more are more right in their face, more about whether they can pay the bills and less about what has become a field that it's for other people. And in the face of communities of color, I think with the exception of the indigenous community. What I'm getting at is that I think when we talk about people being closest to the power, who are close to the pain, we should remember that in order to bring them on board and getting them excited about changing policy on environmental injustice, is to give them the power to envision what the future in this line of work is for them and how they fit into that. And I think we've been making the mistake in the past as organizations that like people of color in their leadership, and mostly like white folks creating a vision and policy about environmental issues, and then trying to get communities of color to jump on board and to help. And then we have conversations like this to get people of color to fight and to use their resources and energy that they've been using on other issues like policing, like housing, like immigration, and other issues that appear to be more on the front burner for these communities. Just, I guess, to summarize, is that we need to ensure that any vision, any work, like any struggle, any like small battle, big battle, needs to have them on board from the beginning, from the design stages of any policy, so that they see a fight, that they see a vision, that they see like strategies that reflect their lived experiences, and that they're not invited to a fight that they didn't start, a fight that they don't see themselves reflected in, a fight that they see is created, is governed, and the vision and what we pitch is based on a different set of people with a different lived experiences, and expect them to be excited about it. And so we need to stop doing that. And I think a new future, I think people of color bring a lot of resources, energy, knowledge, collective wisdom that they've gained in fighting, in civil rights and fighting against police right now, Black Lives Matter movements, immigration, all these other issues. They've done such an amazing job at making progress. It doesn't seem that way, but I think in Grand Rapids, we see it. We see how the city respects, we see how the city commission has changed. And I think this is what communities of color bring to the environmental injustice struggle. And we need to recognize that and ensure that they have a seat at the table, and they have the ability to design, the ability to create their own vision. And it doesn't have to be the same as the existing vision.
I think also, like, he mentioned, people of color have been organizing since the beginning of times, and we are really great at organizing. But we're not good at receiving value in those experiences. I think a lot of organizations want to tokenize people of color's perspectives. We need to start valuing the experiences regardless of their colonialized credentials. Working in indigenous country, there's, all of our elders in our communities are held with high regard because they've spent their lifetime learning and teaching, but at the same time, they're not valued because they don't hold some letters behind their name. Like he says, we do have a lot to share, but it's building true relationships and allies with your friends of color and your populations of color. History has shown us that we shouldn't be trusting anybody. So it takes a lot to walk in and build those relationships. But we do need to start valuing those experiences he mentioned, and to make sure that we're not being tokenized. A lot of people of color may not recognize when they're being tokenized. I know I still don't recognize because I'll speak and say whatever I want in any situation I'm in. But we have a lot of intergenerational history and resources and information that can be used to organize and stay active. But you have to, as non-POC, understand that that relationship is the first step. You need to build a genuine relationship with these organizations of color, institutions of color. From an indigenous perspective or a native perspective, we're not very trusting, and so that the value of the relationship is key in ascertaining or obtaining some of the knowledge that we have as communities.
I really appreciated both of your perspectives, and I completely 100% agree. I do think that, you know, speaking as a white woman, I think that we do have to be able to examine our own privileges so that we can leverage them to walk alongside people of color in their fights. So I think that, you know, going beyond the performative actions of like writing a letter or, you know, and yes, land acknowledgement is great, but there needs to be, you know, a foundation of a culture of support and inclusion and, you know, non-tokenizing manners to back that up. There needs to be action. It can't just be, you know, look, we did this thing, like that's the checkbox. So going beyond that and really doing a deep dive into your own self, but into your internal organization and dismantling some of those cultures of white supremacy within, you know, each of the spaces in which we operate, I think is really important.
I'd like to say something, if I may. I believe everything that Lin and Sergio have said is absolutely on the mark with regard to engagement of our populations of color in the effort. But along with that comes something that organizations like WMEAC and WMEAC as well has failed, and that is in the education of these populations as to the criticality of the situation. We have a glancing understanding of knowledge awareness, but we have not had a focused education of us as people as to how these environmental issues are impacting us in a massively negative way and will have long-term effects. And that needs to go along with that engagement. We can't like do a come on and work with us kind of thing without saying, and here's why. Education is critical, and we have not done it well. The focus group of Black women I have gathered together have emphasized that as a need. Also, if you think about right now, I don't know of a single Black person that will get the COVID vaccination, not one. What does that say? Lack of trust, complete lack of trust. And the engagement process is going to be very, very difficult to bring that body of group in to be a worker partnership to move efforts forward. It's going to be tough.
Thanks, Fran, for that. That was wonderfully put. I think Fran brings up a really great point that a lot of institutions haven't implemented. We've got diversity. We already live in a diverse state. It's that inclusion part that's really hard. I think WMEAC, through their work of the Ideal Committee that I know Fran sits on, has been integral in shaping how WMEAC moves forward. But let's, for instance, take a step back and look at what if the Ideal Committee didn't exist, right? We are missing that perspective into our organization that we wouldn't, as a mostly and historically white organization, been able to touch and to listen and to hear. And so as we move into detokenizing and valuing our opinions of color, it's important that we have that inclusion piece. Diversity is really easy. You know, you can add people of color everywhere, but if you're not truly including them in the conversation and valuing, regardless of their exposure to higher education or whatnot, we all have something valuable to give, and it needs to be appreciated. And it needs to be of value, because people of color have an instinct desire to be an activist and to be involved. But like she mentions, we lack the resources of gathering this education. And I'm sorry, but like while Fran was talking, I got teary-eyed, right? Because this inclusion factor is really hard for us to, as a society, not as WMEAC, but as a society, really hard to attain. I don't know why it's so hard. I think inclusion brings difficulty, right? Fran brings up some good points that she is speaking and bringing from her community. I'm bringing from my community, but imagine, not so long ago, these perspectives weren't even in the equation of how to move an institution or organization forward. So we've already achieved diversity. Let's start working and increasing our inclusion.
I agree with everything that everyone said. Thank you so much for touching on those topics. Lastly, we're gonna go into the Q&A, and we did have a question from April. How do we create more natural trails and make sure they are spaced equally throughout communities, especially in urbanized areas?
So in my education, like, we realized that, it's one thing to have a park way over here that's accessible by everybody. But when we're talking about our external environment, our most impoverished communities have a lack of access to resources to make their communities beautiful. I watched an interesting documentary on Flint, right? And so a lot of these children walk out of their front doors and they don't see anything beautiful, right? That is dictating their relationship to the environment. And so while parks and trails are excellent, and I'm not saying that they're bad, I feel like resources need to be given to our neighborhoods and to our inner city urbanized communities to make them look like parks. Put a park bench, plant some, like, make them beautiful. You are what you see. And so some of these communities just lack the resources to reflect the beauty that they have within their home on the street side. So I'm not a hiker. I like being out in the woods, but I don't like exercise. But what would be great is if everyone was able to walk out their front porch and see, a beautiful environment, and not so urbanized. And so we need to really focus on increasing the beautification of our city.
Can I say one thing quickly? The emphasis that we've had in terms of environmental concerns in our urban environment have always seemed to be more relative to conservation. And maybe we need to kind of broaden our thinking a bit. Just a thought.
I think what Fran mentioned, I think, is really important. When we start talking about access, I think we're getting at the intersectionality of why, and it mirrors a lot how a community, a people gets involved in a fight and a struggle. And I think that if we don't have the same shared experience, or if we don't have access to trails, if we don't grow, if we're not able to get back what was taken from us, that connection with nature, land, and the environment, and we're stuck in an urban cage where everything is concrete, and to leave the city and the area where our neighbors live and people that look like us live is like leaving the green zone and going out to Newaygo, going out to these other parks in Cascade and Ada and North and outside of the greater Grand Rapids area, where we don't feel safe, or we don't feel like where we feel like we're intruding on other people's land, when these are public parks, public lands. And we shouldn't feel like we shouldn't feel a certain way when white people look at us like aren't you a little far from the city where you belong? And so I think a good example to the question that was asked is like looking at the 200 million plus investment that's about to be made downtown. That's a big river that belongs to all of us. Water doesn't, it belongs to like the entire community, right? If public tax dollars are going to be used in a private public partnership, shouldn't all of the city be able to benefit from that? And why just invest only on the Grand River? Why not invest in rivers and the tributaries that lead to it? For example, Plaster Creek. Plaster Creek goes through 3 parks that are in neighborhoods that have a high number of people of color in them. Roosevelt Park, there's where's the park? Kennelshed Park. There's another park that's around there. There's 3 parks that if the river restoration extends to those tributaries that go through other communities, then the distribution of wealth and the investment in infrastructure, like to extend access to the Grand River, and the Grand River ends at Wealthy. Well, the Roosevelt Park neighborhood is there and going up further. And these are ways in which we can use public resources to equitably distribute them and get people access. And like a good way to do that is by creating more trails and systems that other people can use across the city and connect them to downtown, like a jogging trail or a biking trail. You don't have to drive all the way to downtown to like access these resources.
I agree with what Lynn and Sergio both said. I think that, it has to be kind of a bird's eye holistic view on how we can go about, bringing nature and green spaces, trees, green infrastructure, and just beautification and prioritizing neighborhoods who have been completely disinvested in. And there are creative ideas that you can pull from other cities, like Detroit Hives. There's an organization that will, use vacant lots to put in beehives and other native plantings. So it's just kind of finding that creative intersection between, what is possible and what is available, like where are the gaps, and then trying to kind of fill them in collectively, but obviously prioritizing the needs and thoughts and feelings of the people who live in those neighborhoods, which doesn't always happen. But yeah, I think there are a lot of communities that we can pull from, and especially around access. I think Grand Rapids is trying to be a more bike-friendly community, but I still feel unsafe biking. So I think it needs to be, addressed from a holistic perspective moving forward.
I think that river project will be an interesting one. I know there's been a lot of outreach into communities of color who, trusted them enough to share what they wanted and what they needed and what they felt they desired from the river and access to. Because at the end of the day, if the focus or the lens in which this is being created is through the rich white community, it will address and be accessible very easily for the rich white, citizens. And so it'll be interesting how all of the work leading up to this Grand River development will turn out, because I know they did, a concerted effort in reaching out to those populations of color. I was actually contracted for them to outreach into the Native community, and it was literally the last community that they scheduled to meet with. And they, we presented it on a timeline, and I just said, please do not mention that we are the last community that you've reached out to regarding, hopes and dreams for the river, because we are the first people of this area, and to disrespect them that much, to make them the last community in which you reach out to, is just, it's I can't even think of a bad enough word with making it PG. So,
well, Lynn, you may have been the last, but I believe you may have been the only.
I believe that they reached, and I don't know, but that's what they were telling me, is that they reached out to all these other subpopulations, asking what they wanted. it'll be interesting if that's the focus of their outcomes, right? Of what you thought, what your community thought, what their community thought. Because if it's not, and it was just, in school, we learned the Arndt's ladder of participation, right? Do you include people's perspective and thoughts at this level of the ladder or at the bottom of the level and let it guide up? I feel history has proven that they've added us at the top as just like a, like Carissa said in the beginning, as a checkbox, right? We talk to you people. Now we can move on with our plans. But
I gotta say, I can't remember a single solitary community meeting in the 49507 area about this river project. Now one.
That's too bad. That's kind of indicative of, I guess, what the endpoint's going to be, right?
That's exactly what's indicative of what the endpoint's going to be. It's exactly indicative of that.
Well,
Question about it.
At least we're good at organizing, so we'll have to organize around that. But it was an interesting development, the river development. But I'm getting off track. I'll give it back to Skyla.
Thanks, Lynn and Fran. So we're wrapping up, and I'm going to move on to Bo to give the last remarks.
And we have about 1 minute left, maybe less than that. So I will be extremely short with my comments. One actionable goal, right? As we move from history to our story, we have to keep in mind actionable goals. So SB 241, the water shutoff moratorium legislation that is moving in the Senate right now, making sure that we are informed about it. To Fran's point, making sure that we have more of these conversations. This is one of many to come when it comes to what it is that we can do to really actuate and have actionable goals in communities of color, for the BIPOC populations, for persons of color, for communities as a whole. So we thank you all for being here. Thank you, Belinda. Thank you, Carissa. Thank you, Sergio. Thank to everyone who engaged during this conversation, remembering that the mission of WMEAC is to inform, engage, and nurture an inclusive community, acting together to protect natural resources. That's what we're doing today. That's what we hope to do. And thank you to Skyla for a great job moderating, for great questions. So keeping time, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for engagement, and look forward to more of these conversations.